Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of my review of 1983's The Right Stuff. When we last left off, the Soviets had just launched Sputnik 1, kickstarting the space race and leading to one of the film's most memorable and oft-parodied scenes.
It's called Sputnik.
We know. Sit down.
In this scene, two analysts, played by Jeff Goldblum and Harry Shearer, brief a group of government officials, including President Dwight Eisenhower, on Sputnik and the state of the American space program. These characters are later revealed to be employees of NASA, though this would be anachronistic, as the National Aeronautics and Space Act creating that agency would not be signed into law until July 29, 1958, nearly a year after the launch of Sputnik. It is possible, however, that they are working for the National Advisory Council on Aeronautics, or NACA, NASA's immediate predecessor. Among the many techniques the film employs in the service of efficient storytelling is the use of composite characters and archetypes, and perhaps the best example of this is this character, played by Scott Beach. Though credited only as German scientist, he's clearly meant to represent Dr. Wernher von Braun and the other German V-2 rocket scientists brought to the United States after the war as part of Operation Paperclip. This is especially evident in this line.
We could have orbited a satellite a year ago if we had been given the green light. Now we must get something up there quick and dirty any way at all.
This is a reference to Project Orbiter, an early plan to launch a satellite proposed by von Braun in 1954 while he was still working at the Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. The proposal involved modifying a Redstone ballistic missile by extending its fuel tanks and adding 3 additional solid fuel stages, giving it enough delta-V to launch a small satellite into orbit. The timing of the proposal was fortuitous, as in 1955 the United States government announced that it would orbit a satellite as part of the International Geophysical Year, an 18-month event lasting from 1957 to 1958, during which teams from around the world would collaborate on various Earth science experiments. However, despite von Braun's team already having a suitable launcher ready, the task was given to the U.S. Navy's Project Vanguard. This was a purely political move, as President Eisenhower feared that using a military missile, particularly one designed by former Nazis, to launch America's first satellite would be seen as too aggressive by the Soviets. In contrast, the Vanguard rocket, though developed by the Navy, was built entirely from components of civilian research rockets and was seen as the more peaceful option. Unfortunately, the Vanguard rocket was far behind in development, and extensive delays led to the Soviets beating the Americans into space not once, but twice, as exactly 1 month after Sputnik 1, Sputnik 2 lifted off, carrying with it the first living creature to orbit the Earth, a dog named Laika. In response, the Vanguard rocket and satellite were rushed to the launch pad at Cape Canaveral. On December 6, 1957, in front of millions of Americans watching on live TV, the engine ignited, the rocket lifted into the air, then immediately fell back onto the pad and exploded into a massive fireball. This was a national embarrassment, and in a bid to save face, the government ordered Project Orbiter resurrected. Von Braun and his team pulled their modified Redstone, now known as Juno 1, out of storage, and on March 17, 1958, launched Explorer 1, America's first satellite, into orbit. While von Braun's role in the American space program is today infamous, by boiling him down into a stock German scientist character, the film ends up greatly overstating that role. Though by 1957, von Braun was well known to the American public, having appeared in a 1955 episode of Disneyland and written numerous magazine articles on space travel, he was still only an engineer at Redstone Arsenal and would not have been advising the highest levels of government. Anyway, back to the scene. Knowing that the Soviets' next logical move will be to place a man in space, the analysts present a list of possible candidates who might make good astronauts.
These are people we felt would be excellent, especially in the splashdown stage. These people, of course, very experienced in handling their own machinery.
And they already have their own helmets. I don't know if that's a factor.
And as you'll see, they're quite comfortable in conditions of flame. Now, this is personnel who have very well developed equilibrium.
Good middle ear. Oh, now this was my first choice. Take a look at the man with the hood on. You see, because he works without benefit of eyesight, his other senses have become acutely sharpened.
We feel that once in space, there'll be very little need for eyeballing at any rate. This individual combines many of the plus factors that we've mentioned. Ease with flames, comfort at heights, and agility in the splashdown phase. Also, he is available as of the 15th.
No. No. I want test pilots.
This is actually less ridiculous than it might seem. At the time, doctors knew very little about how the human body would react to spaceflight, and variously speculated that in a state of weightlessness, an astronaut's blood would not circulate properly, that they would be unable to swallow and digest food, and that without a fixed sense of up and down, they would become hopelessly disoriented and confused. Consequently, a wide variety of people accustomed to extreme environments were put forward as possible astronaut candidates, including race car drivers, mountain climbers, and deep-sea divers. In the end, however, President Eisenhower decided on military test pilots, who were not only highly skilled at handling untested high-performance vehicles, but were already employed by the government, making administration easier. The analysts thus head off to Edwards Air Force Base in search of astronauts for Project Mercury, America's first manned space program. Here again, the needs of dynamic storytelling obscure the actual facts, as in reality, astronaut selection was done not by traveling NASA recruiters, but by asking the commanders of test flying establishments to recommend suitable candidates. To qualify for Project Mercury, pilots had to be no older than 40, no taller than 5 feet 11 inches or heavier than 180 pounds, be married, and possess a bachelor's degree in engineering or the equivalent. All but the height requirement were eventually relaxed, a fact which allowed John Glenn, who did not possess an engineering degree, to be selected. The initial call for recommendations yielded 110 names, which after careful review were pared down to 69. These men were invited to secret briefings where they were briefed on the particulars of Project Mercury and asked if they were interested in participating. 32 men expressed interest and moved on to medical evaluation, which is where the film takes us next. But before moving on, one fun detail. This guy here behind the bar at Pancho's? That's the real Chuck Yeager. No, really. We next arrive at the Loveless Clinic in Albuquerque, where the 32 astronaut candidates are subjected to a formidable battery of medical tests designed to weed out all but the most physically fit. Here, the film does an excellent job of depicting some of the more extreme tests, like this much-dreaded procedure where an electrified needle was inserted in the patient's arm to gauge muscle function.
Why are you doing this to me?
I'm afraid there's no simple way to explain that to you. It's nothing to worry about.
But this sequence barely scratches the surface, as in reality the candidates were subjected to nearly every test in the medical arsenal, including countless blood draws and x-rays, barium enemas, water immersion to determine total body fat, whole body radiation counts, endurance tests like stationary cycling and the Harvard STEP test, extensive psychological evaluations, and even a test in which cold water was injected into the ear to induce vertigo. Additional tests were also carried out at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, such as centrifuge runs and sensory deprivation tests in a dark, soundproof room. This test, however, appears to be a creative combination of several real-life devices, such as a heat chamber lined with infrared lamps and what astronauts referred to as an idiot box, a contraption covered in lights, sirens, and bells which candidates had to continuously silence by flipping a sequence of switches. One interesting detail which reveals the extensive research that went into the film appears in this scene, also widely parodied.
Medicine-y. 93 seconds. Read it and weep.
Did you hear that?
I don't know about that. We're competing with Arch and Jughead.
While in reality this lung capacity test was conducted individually rather than in a group, the top scorers were indeed John Glenn and Scott Carpenter, with endurance scores of 151 and 171 seconds respectively. The sequence also touches on the politics that would come to dominate the astronauts' public and private lives.
I'd like to meet your wife.
My wife?
Yes, you're married, aren't you?
Yeah, sure, I'm married, all right.
At the time, Cooper was estranged from his wife Trudy and had to convince her to return and put on the appearance of a stable, happy family in order for him to become an astronaut. Finally, at a press conference at the Dolly Madison House in Washington, D.C., we are introduced to America's first astronauts, the Mercury 7. They are, in addition to Cooper and Grissom, John Glenn, played by Ed Harris, Scott Carpenter, played by Charles Frank, Alan Shepard, played by Scott Glenn, Wally Schirra, played by Lance Hendrickson, and Deke Slayton, played by Scott Paulin. Here again, the film slightly overdramatizes the actual event, which in reality was a much more sedate affair.
After a long and unprecedented series of evaluations, which told our medical scientists of their superb adaptability to their upcoming flight.
Are here after a long and perhaps unprecedented series of evaluations which told our medical consultants and scientists of their superb adaptability to their coming flight.
It is my pleasure to introduce to you 7 Americans, gentlemen all.
It's my pleasure to introduce to you, and I consider it a very real honor, gentlemen,
Americans, Mercury
These, ladies and gentlemen, are the nation's Mercury astronauts.
You know, I don't think any of us could really go on with something like this if we didn't have pretty good backing at home, really. My wife's attitude towards this has been the same as it's been all along through my flying. If it's what I want to do, she's behind it, and by golly, my kids are too, 100%.
I don't think any of us could really go on with something like this if we didn't have pretty good backing at home, really. My wife's attitude toward this has been the same as it has been all along through all my flying, that if it's what I want to do, and she's behind it, and the kids are too, 100%.
When I think of Orville and Wilbur Wright standing on a hill at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, tossing a coin in the air to see which one would take the first airplane flight, and then I think of us here today. I just thank God I live in a country where the best and the finest in a man can be brought out.
If you want to look at it one way, like the Wright brothers stood at Kitty Hawk about 50 years ago.
However, the part at the end really did happen.
Gentlemen, which one of you will be first into space?
Mercury 7 are immediately elevated to the status of heroes and thrust into the national spotlight, and the film again does an excellent job depicting the downsides of this sudden fame, such as the astronauts' families being endlessly hounded by the press and the endless micromanaging of personal image.
Virgil I. Grissom. Or
Gus.
What was that?
Gus. Nobody calls me by that other name.
Gus. An astronaut named Gus? What's your middle name?
Ivan.
Ivan. All right. All right. You can be Gus.
There's great character work here overall, with lots of fun real-life details sprinkled throughout, such as Alan Shepard's obsession with the comedian Bill Dana's character Jose Jimenez, whom he would quote constantly.
My name is Jose Jimenez.
Well, now I see that you have some of your space equipment with you. What is that called? The crash helmet?
Oh, I hope not.
Jose Jimenez on approach. They want to make me an astronaut. Oh, I hope not.
My name, Jose Jimenez.
The film also delves into the personal conflicts between the astronauts, especially between Alan Shepard, an inveterate philanderer, and John Glenn, who insists that the astronauts maintain an image as clean-cut, upstanding family men for the sake of the American public.
I'm talking about keeping our pants zipped and our wicks dry around here.
Mr. Glenn, you are way out of line. I'd advise you not to try to foist your view of morality on anybody else in this group. Each man here has volunteered to do a job. Each man here is devoting long hours of training to prepare for it. And Mr. Glenn, as long as a man uses good sense, what he does with his zipper or his wick is his own business.
But in its bid to deconstruct the mythos of the Mercury 7 and paint them as unwilling propaganda pawns, the film grossly distorts the dynamics of the real Mercury program. This is especially evident in this scene, where the astronauts are presented with what they are told is the final configuration of the Mercury space capsule.
Where are you planning on putting a window?
Window? There's no window.
No window. What about the hatch?
The hatch?
Yeah, the hatch. We need a hatch with explosive bolts that we can open ourselves.
I think there is something you do not understand. This is the final form of the capsule.
Again, this overstates the role of von Braun and his colleagues in the Mercury program. In reality, no German scientists were involved in the design of the Mercury spacecraft, which was built by McDonnell Aircraft of St. Louis. Von Braun's involvement was strictly in modifying and man-rating the Redstone booster for the first suborbital Mercury flights. This scene also implies that the Mercury astronauts were initially considered as little more than passengers or scientific payloads, and had to fight NASA for the right to be treated like pilots and given control of the spacecraft. Indeed, in an earlier scene, Chuck Yeager gives this as his reason for not wanting to become an astronaut.
Well, that just means that you boys don't need no honest-to-God pilots. You know, what you ought to get is a little old lab rabbit to curl up inside your damn capsule. You know, with his heart going pitter-patter and a wire up the kazoo.
But this, too, is completely untrue. According to the book We 7, when first contacted by NASA, all 7 Mercury astronauts expressed concerns that the project would be merely a stunt and not a real test flying program. However, early briefings quickly convinced them that their test piloting skills would be put to the greatest possible use. Indeed, the Mercury 7 were intimately involved in the design of the spacecraft and the entire space launch system, with each astronaut being assigned a different technical specialty to investigate and report to the others. Scott Carpenter handled communications and navigation, Alan Shepard the worldwide spacecraft tracking system and naval recovery teams, John Glenn the layout of the spacecraft instrument panel, Wally Schirra the spacesuit and life support system, Gus Grissom the manual attitude control system, Gordo Cooper the Redstone launcher, and Deke Slayton the Atlas launcher. There were frequent disagreements, but largely among the astronauts themselves rather than between them and NASA. For instance, Scott Carpenter and Gus Grissom advocated for the use of a 3-axis hand controller where yaw was controlled by twisting, while Deke Slayton, an aviation traditionalist, insisted on the inclusion of conventional rudder pedals to save on training. And NASA listened intently to the astronauts' feedback. Following his May 5, 1961 mission, Alan Shepard reported the twin circular portholes and periscope on the first model Mercury capsule provided insufficient visibility, and in response, engineers replaced them with a single trapezoidal window directly in front of the astronaut. The original hatch, which was secured by 70 bolts and could only be opened from the outside, was also replaced by a version with explosive bolts which could be blown open by the astronaut in an emergency. Both improvements were introduced on Gus Grissom's Liberty Bell 7 capsule and retained on all subsequent missions. The film further implies that there was friction between NASA and the astronauts over whether the first American in space would be a human or a chimpanzee.
We have developed a fully automated vehicle. All we see from the occupants in the capsule, you see, is data. The so-called astronaut would merely be a redundant component.
While some astronauts may have privately resented being beaten into space by a chimpanzee, publicly all understood and acknowledged that the Mercury program was being conducted in a deliberate and methodical manner in order to ensure that when a man eventually did fly the spacecraft, it would be refined into its safest, most reliable form. As John Glenn wrote in We 7, "We were not in this program to perform great space feats, but to gather valuable information for the future. If we tried to interrupt or shortcut this process, we would not have proven very much in the long run. It was far more important for us to do it right, we felt, than to do it the first." This methodical engineering process would result in 19 unmanned missions being flown before the first human astronaut was launched into space. 9 of these flights were conducted using the diminutive Little Joe rocket, a cheap solid-fuel booster used to test the spacecraft's launch escape system under actual flight conditions. Mercury Redstone 1 and 1A tested the Redstone booster and the Mercury capsule's heat shield and attitude control system. Mercury Redstone 2 carried the chimpanzee Ham on a short suborbital mission, and the Mercury Redstone BD, or Booster Development Flight, sought to correct the excessive acceleration and vibration encountered on Ham's flight. 6 unmanned missions were also flown using the larger Atlas booster, which due to its advanced design suffered from reliability issues and had to be extensively tested before it could carry a man into orbit. Big Joe 1 carried a boilerplate Mercury capsule to test its aerodynamics and heat shield under orbital conditions. Mercury Atlas 1 and 2 tested the rocket capsule combination on a suborbital trajectory. Mercury Atlas 3 and 4 carried a robotic astronaut simulator to test the capsule's environmental control systems in orbit, and Mercury Atlas 5 carried the chimpanzee Enos on a short 2-orbit mission. Many of these launches ended in failure, and while the film tries to depict this disheartening trial and error process, The extensive use of stock footage leads to a number of anachronistic and unrelated launches being shown. For example, this launch is of a Titan 1 ICBM, in fact, likely the same Titan 1 launched using the climax of Dr. No, which we covered back in the first episode of Real Engineering. However, the date given, July 29, 1960, corresponds with the launch of Mercury Atlas 1, an unmanned test flight which ended in failure when the Atlas booster disintegrated 58 seconds into the flight. Reportedly, upon seeing the rocket explode, Alan Shepard turned to John Glenn and quipped, "I'm glad we got that out of the way." The other launches in this montage are, in order, a Thor intermediate-range ballistic missile, likely the very first Thor launch on July 29, 1960, an unspecified Atlas, a Juno 2 satellite launcher, likely the AM-16 launch of July 16, 1959, the unmanned Mercury Atlas 3 flight of April 25, 1961, which was self-destructed 7 minutes after launch, and 3 more unspecified Atlases.
2, 1, 0.
While intercut with an Atlas launch, the comical champagne cork parachute deployment at the end is actually from the unmanned Mercury Redstone 1 mission on November 21, 1960. This was the first attempt to test the complete booster capsule combination. 2 seconds after liftoff, however, the engine suddenly cut out and the rocket settled back onto the pad. Immediately, the capsule escape tower jettisoned and the capsule deployed both its main and reserve parachutes. The scientists and technicians in the launch blockhouse began to panic, as the rocket was still fully fueled and even a slight breeze catching the parachutes could tip it over and cause a massive explosion. After various solutions were put forward, including shooting the rocket with a rifle to drain the propellant tanks, since no wind was forecast for that day, it was decided to just wait and let the batteries run down and the liquid oxygen boil off before approaching the rocket. The cause of this bizarre 4-inch flight was traced to a pair of control and power cables plugged into the base of the rocket fins, which were designed to be pulled free at liftoff. Ordinarily, the control cable was shorter, so it separated first, but when the proper cable couldn't be found, ground crews instead used a longer one, tying it off to the required length. At liftoff, however, the tied-off control cable came loose and separated after the power cable, triggering an abort. The strange sequence of events that followed was the product of the Mercury capsule's simple open-loop control system. When the engine shut down, the system interpreted this as a regular engine cutoff at altitude and jettisoned the control tower as programmed. However, as the capsule's sensors detected both 1 g of acceleration and 1 bar of atmospheric pressure, the system assumed that the capsule was returning from space and deployed the main parachute. And when the limp main chute failed to generate any tension on the shrouds, the system assumed it had become fouled and duly deployed the reserve chute. The capsule had, in effect, done everything it had been programmed to, though not in a way that anyone expected. The Soviets, too, followed a methodical step-by-step flight program, though unlike the Americans who preferred to test individual subsystems in isolation before integrating them, the Soviets used an all-up approach in which multiple systems were tested together in a single launch. While this greatly increased the risk of something going wrong, it also allowed the program to advance at a much faster pace. Furthermore, while Project Mercury was a civilian project conducted in the full view of the American public, the Soviet program was shrouded in military secrecy, and only successful launches were ever announced. To the rest of the world, this gave the illusion of an unbroken string of unqualified successes. In the end, the faster pace of their program, combined with a several-year head start in astronautics, allowed the Soviets to beat the United States again and launch the first man into orbit, Yuri Gagarin, on April 12, 1961. Like Sputnik before it, this feat galvanized the American public and kicked Project Mercury into high gear. Tune in next time as we cover the first pioneering space flights of the Mercury 7, only on our own devices.